I think some of it's a bit hyperbole. So, for example, his first tour when his code name is Red Fox, and that there was a concern, and he's written that he was about to be murdered, purely on the basis that an Australian magazine had outed the fact that he was in Afghanistan. The fact that that was in the public domain, and to make a logic leap to the fact that he's going to be in imminent danger of being murdered are two different things, I think. But that's obviously something you would do to write books. I think that,
Having now seen more segments of the book, what would you say your overwhelming feelings?
well, I think we now have more clarity on the missions that Harry took part in, and we now know that there were 6 missions in which he took life. We also know that he's quite hard over on the fact that he was absolutely involved in what he would term to be courageous restraint, and that he only took out legitimate targets, and he went back to the UK with his conscience clear. And indeed, that's important because he recounts that his squadron commander, who would have been a major in Afghanistan, was always looking out for whether there were any irregular kills. But in a sense, there's a sort of ill advised parable of Harry here, because the notion of courageous restraint first occurred in 2009 with General Stan McChrystal, because of the number of CIVCAS, civilian casualties, that were being created by air power. And of course, Harry was in a Apache, which is part of air power. And Stan McChrystal was ultimately sacked for ill-advised comments about President Obama. And I still think there are a lot of ill-advised comments in what Harry has said, because it's okay, for example, saying that his squadron commander and Harry had a clear conscience that they didn't take part in any irregular kills. But if you write things down like this, they're going to be pored over by other people who might take a different view, and lead to subsequent questions. For example, freedom of information requests, or human rights lawyers wanting more clarification. And indeed, one of the things that people don't often understand about Afghanistan, and this came out of a court case, Sadr Mohammed versus the MOD, was that there was extended territoriality of the ECHR, the European Convention of Human Rights. So I still think there are lots of ill-advised things in what he's written, which could open vulnerable flanks in further questioning. It doesn't mean that anything he did was illegal, in my view, because it doesn't look that way, but it could lead to those second-order questions.
And could you think of any specific examples?
Well, the key one is any targeting in war needs to be legitimate, proportionate, and necessary. So when does someone who is a Taliban cease to be a threat? And that is a key component of engagement in any theatre, but particularly in counterinsurgency. Now, it seems to me that I would be content, as his squadron commander was, that everything he did was okay, but I'm not a human rights lawyer.
He said that he was, for example, willing to risk crashing or being taken prisoner on his first ever trip out on the helicopter. And he also said about how I was one of the first in my squadron to pull the trigger in anger. Does that strike you as concerning in any way?
I mean, that's just a fact of life. Someone has to do that to be the first. Whether you need to record that, I don't know. I think some of it's a bit hyperbole. So, for example, his first tour when his code name is Red Fox, and that there was a concern, and he's written that he was about to be murdered, purely on the basis that an Australian magazine had outed the fact that he was in Afghanistan. The fact that that was in the public domain, and to make a logic leap to the fact that he's going to be in imminent danger of being murdered are two different things, I think. But that's obviously something you would do to write books. I think the second one which struck me was the fact of the attack on Bastion itself, and that he perceived himself to be the target. Now, I do remember this very well, because it was the worst attack in terms of the loss of combat aircraft for the Americans since Vietnam, when that night in September 2012, 8 Harriers and a C-130 aircraft were destroyed by the Taliban. Now, it does say in the book that Bastion, which was huge, was the size of Reading. So again, to say that he was the target is probably a bit of hyperbole when there were 15 attackers who were all neutralised in one way or another.
He talks about how he was trained to otherize them, which is in reference to the enemy, and how that is an unavoidable part of soldiering. Would you agree with that?
I think I do agree with him on the otherwise thing. I guess you could say, well, we've always done this. We have Jerry and Fritz. And so you sort of make a characterization of the enemy, as they kind of did in Afghanistan with, calling them Terry Taliban. So you try and distance yourself from them as human beings in that sense. I think his analogy of he saw them as chess pieces is probably the wrong analogy. Not that it really matters, because the number of moves you can do in chess is something like 10 to the power of 40. It's huge. He was really knocking over skittles at the tactical level.
Do you think in hindsight that knowing these details and how he specifically as well sort of thinks that he's the target in this, do you think that in hindsight it was probably too big of a security risk for him to even be out there? Do you think it was too risky perhaps?
Well, I think that really comes down to the conundrum of being the spare. I mean, he always said that he would leave the army if he was not allowed to go with his men and women into combat operations. And of course, by the time that he went to Afghanistan, then there was a new spare. We've got Prince William was already born, and all the other royal children were born. So he was a spare without a job, and therefore needed something to do. And that's why I think he kind of lionizes his time in the army, because it did give him a purpose, which he didn't have at other times in his life.
What can you see happening from this, especially in terms of like the Taliban response? Do you think this is going to escalate in any ways, or do you think that was it? That was the worst it could get?
Well, from the point of view of the book, you really need it to be vetted for two reasons. Firstly, for operational security reasons, and secondly, for personal security reasons. And that's where the notion of future plots against him and wider plots against either the royal family or events he is at, like, for example, the Invictus Games, come in. Now, I'd be less worried about the Taliban, who I see as Pashtun nationalists rather than global jihadists. So I don't think that's potentially an issue. And indeed, the notion of high-end coordinated plots by either Al-Qaeda or IS are just not on the radar at the moment. But it's these sorts of passages which lead to energized people with grievances and ideologies who can then either be radicalized or prompted into action, which is the real danger. Think also, of course, the press internationally will pick up on minor things. So, for example, yesterday we had 20 people protesting in Helmand province where Harry was, and that went fairly international in terms of press coverage. I mean, that is really, really minor stuff, but that shows that if, for example, you had a Salman Rushdie fatwa equivalent by some cleric, and of course, there's millions of clerics in the world from the Muslim population, because it's a 2 billion population. That would also, I suggest, be picked up and amplified because of the nature of it going sort of viral. So that's the real danger, that the sort of energized lone wolf. Now, lone wolves don't have iron plots, and the lethality of lone actors is pretty low these days, but that doesn't mean that people wouldn't necessarily be killed or suffer. I don't necessarily think that would be Prince Harry, but there could be collateral damage elsewhere to other people.
Could you make any predictions about what could happen now since the release of the book in terms of a military perspective?
Well, I think from the sort of conceptual level, I think the sort of top brass of the army need to take a long look at how we're doing our sort of cultural training, because there's this view that within the armed forces there's a sort of a civilian military gap, and we sort of pride ourselves, or the differences are in terms of how we present ourselves. We have different uniforms, different procedures, but we also think that there's a value gap, that everything we do is righteous and honourable, and we do it with good intent. But there's good and bad in both the army and society, and some of the things he's done are dishonourable in terms of dissing his family and things like that. And that's not something that you would normally expect to see from a military officer. So in terms of decorum, duty and dignity, he's sort of gone down in quite a number of people's estimations, but that doesn't negate the fact that he was a combat veteran who served his country and did good things and honourable things in setting up the Invictus Games for injured personnel.
Do you want to see change in that respect?
Well, I think you should always assess what you're doing. So you go around a virtuous circle to see if there are things you need to change. I mean, the notion of us having a cultural affinity to body counts is something that, if it's there, needs to be challenged. Now, it is easier, of course, for people like air corps pilots, because you've got the camera gun, which you can review the video evidence of, which is what he says in the book. You can do that, but of course you should be doing that so you can learn about how you achieve your mission and how you might do things differently in the future, not trying to isolate body counts, which can be difficult sometimes. Now, of course, because he mentioned things about lone motorcyclists, which you'd have pinged from some distance away, he could count those. But when you're using 30mm cannon, which he does say, for example, in the book, turn concrete apartments into Swiss cheese. If you're doing that on mass targets, which he never needed to do, you've got a different order of magnitude. So I would like us to get away from this notion of counting numbers and go back to the notion of, did we achieve the mission, and how might we have done that better by the way we organised our tactics on the ground or in the air.